May 17, 1943. Over the moonlit Ruhr Valley, the engines of a Lancaster bomber rattled the air like the heartbeat of a mechanical giant. Inside the aircraft, the crew of 7 held their breath. Below them stretched a vast black lake, calm and unsuspecting. The pilot, a young man no older than 24, adjusted his controls as a strange, spinning sphere dropped from the plane's belly. For an instant, it skipped across the surface, once, twice, 3 times, before vanishing into the wall of the Möhne Dam. A moment of silence followed, then a shudder through the earth. Water erupted in a violent white plume, a mountain of liquid collapsing in on itself. When the mist cleared, the dam was gone. One of the most impregnable structures in Nazi Germany had fallen, not to brute force, but to an idea born in the mind of a quiet British engineer named Barnes Wallis. To those who knew him, Wallis seemed an unlikely architect of destruction. His colleagues at Vickers Aircraft remembered him as the man who often forgot his umbrella but never a calculation. He had a habit of speaking in murmurs, his thoughts always 3 steps ahead of the conversation. Born in 1887, he was a product of an age that still believed intellect could redeem chaos. Before the war, he designed airships that floated gracefully through the clouds, symbols of peace, not war. But by 1940, with Britain's cities burning under German bombs, Wallis found himself facing a question that would torment him for years. How could he use the precision of science to end a war built on madness? Britain was desperate. Night after night, the Luftwaffe reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Yet when British bombers struck back, their raids were clumsy, scattering explosives across open fields instead of factories. The Royal Air Force wanted bigger bombs, heavier payloads, more destruction. Wallis wanted accuracy. He believed that war, if it must be fought, should be fought intelligently. If we can strike the enemy's power at its source, he wrote in his notebook, we can end the need for endless killing. His calculations led him to an audacious target, the dams of the Ruhr Valley. They supplied hydroelectric power to Germany's industrial heart, steelworks, munitions plants, and railway systems. Destroy them, and Hitler's war machine would grind to a halt. But the dams were protected by thick concrete walls and underwater torpedo nets. Ordinary bombs would bounce off or sink harmlessly. So Wallis began to think differently. He imagined a weapon that could skim the surface of the water like a skipping stone, strike the dam's wall, sink to the right depth, and explode with hydraulic force. The physics were sound, but the concept seemed absurd. When he presented his first sketches to the Air Ministry, the room filled with polite confusion. Bombs don't bounce, Wallis, one officer said with forced amusement. And even if they did, what would you do? Play marbles with the Germans? Wallis smiled faintly and replied, if it breaks their toys, perhaps. Dismissed but undeterred, he returned home and built a miniature dam in his garden. His children helped him fill buckets and roll steel bearings across the surface. The neighbors thought him eccentric. His wife, Mary, called him our resident magician. He tested angles, speeds, and spin rates with mathematical obsession. Each failure taught him something new. In his diary, he wrote, if a man has not failed, he has not tried hard enough to find the truth. Slowly, the design took shape, a sphere that would spin backward before release, hugging the water as it skipped toward its target. He called it upkeep. By early 1942, Wallis had enough data to prove his theory. He wrote to the air staff with careful urgency, the destruction of the Ruhr dams is within reach, provided precise conditions are met. Weeks passed with no reply. When he finally received one, it was a terse rejection. His superiors saw him as an idealist dabbling in fantasy. He might have given up then, had it not been for one sympathetic officer who quietly arranged a test at Chesil Beach. It was a gray, windswept morning when Wallis watched his first prototype tumble from a small aircraft. The bomb hit the waves, bounced high, then shattered on impact. Wallis frowned, made a note, and asked to try again. On the third attempt, something miraculous happened. The weapon skimmed perfectly, maintaining its spin, striking the mock dam target dead center. The explosion was modest, but the proof undeniable. A military observer reportedly turned to Wallis and said, "Good Lord, it actually works." For the first time, the engineer allowed himself a smile. But the success raised another challenge, convincing those in power to fund it. Britain's resources were stretched thin. Every bomb, every plane, every drop of fuel mattered. Wallace wrote letter after letter, each more impassioned than the last. He argued not as a soldier, but as a mathematician pleading for reason. If we can destroy the dams, he insisted, we shall strike a blow disproportionate to the means used. Eventually, his persistence wore them down. The Air Ministry approved limited production and authorized a special squadron to carry out the operation. The men who would use his invention were young, daring, and largely unaware that their mission's success depended on a scientist's equations scribbled in a notebook. By now, the war had entered its most volatile phase. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. Allied cities endured nightly raids. Amid that chaos, Wallace worked in near secrecy, refining every detail. He tested bomb casings, calculated release speeds, and designed a sighting device that used converging spotlights to judge altitude at exactly 60 feet, the only height from which the bomb could be released successfully. The precision required was maddening. A single miscalculation could turn triumph into disaster. At times, exhaustion overtook him. "I fear," he confessed in one letter, "that the weight of numbers may crush imagination entirely." But imagination, not numbers, was his greatest weapon. He believed reason could still shape destiny in a world gone mad. Late one night, staring at the spinning model on his workbench, he whispered, "This may be the strangest thing I ever built, but perhaps the most necessary." By March 1943, the prototypes were ready. The Royal Air Force began assembling a new unit, Squadron 617, trained to fly lower, faster, and more precisely than any before them. They would test his creation in secrecy, under code name Operation Chastise. When Wallace visited the base, he watched the young pilots joking and smoking beside their planes. They called the bomb the skipping egg. He chuckled softly, though he knew too well how many of them might never return. As he stood on the runway, the wind carrying the scent of oil and spring rain, he realized his dream had taken on a life of its own. The drawings that once filled his quiet study were now steel, motion, and imminent danger. For a moment, he wondered whether the price of proving he was right might be too high. But then he thought of the cities bombed into ash, the children huddled in shelters, the endless toll of war. His invention, for all its destructive power, was meant to save lives by ending the conflict sooner. When the first aircraft roared overhead, testing its engines before the mission, Wallace tilted his head skyward. "Fly true," he murmured. The ground vibrated beneath his feet as the plane disappeared into the clouds. In that instant he knew there was no turning back. The calculations were done, the physics sound, the fate sealed. What began as a madman's sketch had become Britain's most daring gamble. And though he did not yet know it, within weeks, the world would witness a sight so strange and devastating that even he would struggle to comprehend it. January 1941. The snow outside the General Electric Research Building in Schenectady, New York, was thick enough to muffle footsteps, but inside, the air buzzed with electricity, literally. In a cramped laboratory filled with the faint hum of motors and the tang of ozone, Dr. Sanford Moss leaned over a battered turbine housing, his fingers tracing the metal like a man reading Braille. Around him stood a small team of engineers and technicians, men whose wool coats were thrown haphazardly over chairbacks, sleeves rolled up despite the chill. They were not soldiers, yet every one of them knew they were fighting a war that had not yet officially reached America. On a bench nearby lay a newspaper, its headline screaming of London's nightly bombardments. Someone had scrawled beneath it in pencil, "Next stop, us." Moss exhaled heavily. "They don't know what we're building," he muttered. His assistant, a thin young man named Charlie Brandt, handed him a wrench. "Maybe that's for the best," Charlie replied. "If they did, they'd think we were mad." Moss allowed himself a dry smile. Mad, perhaps, but with purpose. For nearly 3 decades, since the First World War, he had been haunted by an idea that seemed too ambitious for its time. A new kind of aircraft engine that didn't rely on pistons or propellers, but on the power of compressed air and fire, a gas turbine. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but Moss knew it could change everything about how wars were fought. The problem was that no one believed it could work. The Army Air Corps had dismissed the concept years earlier, calling it a theoretical curiosity. Even within General Electric, the company that prided itself on innovation, the turbine project was treated like an eccentric hobby. Funding was limited, resources scarce, and wartime priorities were shifting toward immediate needs: bombers, fuel, steel. Moss's team worked after hours, using leftover parts from other departments. Yet the older man's calm persistence had a strange magnetism. People wanted to follow him. There was something about his quiet conviction, his refusal to yield to ridicule, that inspired those around him. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The radio announcement crackled through the lab that Sunday morning, and every man froze mid-task. For a long moment, the hum of the machinery was the only sound. Moss turned to his crew, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "I think they'll be needing us sooner than we thought." Within days, the project was no longer a side experiment. Washington wanted results, and fast. Across the Atlantic, the British were already a step ahead. A young RAF officer named Frank Whittle had been developing a similar idea, a turbojet engine, but lacked industrial muscle to perfect it. Britain's survival depended on speed, and Whittle's work had caught the attention of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Soon, G received blueprints under tight secrecy. The plan: build America's first jet engine before the Nazis fielded one. Moss was now at the center of a race that few even knew existed. The challenge was monumental. The British design worked in theory, but it required alloys that could withstand impossible heat, precision machining that the U.S. factories had never attempted, and compressors that refused to behave. At one point, a prototype compressor wheel exploded during testing, sending shards of metal through the lab wall like shrapnel. The engineers ducked, coughing through the smoke. Moss simply stared at the smoking wreckage, then said calmly, "We're getting closer." Charlie, shaken, asked, "Closer to what, success or the morgue?" Moss only chuckled. Sometimes they looked the same on the way there. As winter deepened, so did the urgency. Reports from Europe grew grim. The Luftwaffe's Me-262, a rumored jet fighter under development, threatened to change air combat forever. If Germany succeeded first, Allied bombers would be sitting ducks. Moss's lab became a fortress of secrecy. Guards were posted outside. Workers swore oaths of silence. Even the janitors were cleared by the War Department. The team labored in 12-hour shifts, sustained by coffee and patriotic stubbornness. They melted experimental alloys, tested new turbine blades, and destroyed nearly everything they built. One night in April 1942, a thunderstorm raged outside as the men gathered around a new prototype mounted to a test stand. It looked unimpressive, a stubby cylinder of pipes and bolts, far smaller than the roaring piston engines of bombers. But to Moss, it was a glimpse of the future. "If this runs," he said, "air warfare will never be the same." Lightning flashed through the windows. Charlie flipped the ignition switch. The machine coughed, shuddered, then emitted a rising whine unlike any sound they had heard before, a smooth, otherworldly scream. The lab vibrated. Pressure gauges quivered in the red. Then, abruptly, the roar cut off, followed by silence and the smell of scorched metal. It hadn't lasted long, but the men stared at each other in disbelief. It had worked. For a few brief seconds, compressed air and fire had spun a turbine fast enough to sustain itself. Moss turned to his crew with a rare grin. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've just built the engine of the future." But celebration was short-lived. Within weeks, Washington's demands intensified. They wanted a working jet aircraft within a year. The Army had selected Bell Aircraft to design the airframe, and Moss's turbine, now designated the IA, would power it. The pressure was suffocating. GE's leadership began to doubt Moss's pace. The military wanted military efficiency, not scientific patience. "They think this is just another production line," Moss confided to Charlie one night. "But you can't rush a new age into existence. You have to earn it." Rumors began to swirl that the project might be transferred to another company, one with more manpower and less idealism. Moss ignored them. He was focused on one thing only: perfection. Each time the engine failed, he personally took notes, adjusted bearings, rebalanced turbines. He was meticulous to the point of obsession, a man who could spend hours polishing a compressor blade with emery cloth just to shave off 1 ounce of resistance. "He treats it like a living thing," one machinist said, "like it's his child." As the months passed, something else began to shift. The engineers, once skeptical, now spoke of the project with reverence. They joked less, worked longer, and treated every test run like a battle. Outside the lab, the war dragged on with staggering losses. Inside, a handful of men believed they held the key to changing its outcome. Yet Moss rarely allowed himself to dream. He had seen too many brilliant ideas die in bureaucracy or blow themselves apart on the test stand. On a humid evening in late June, Moss stood alone in the quiet lab, looking at the dormant engine. The war had finally reached America's heart. Factories thundered across the nation, soldiers marched to unknown futures, and he, an old engineer who once tinkered with turbines for fun, was suddenly building a weapon that could decide the fate of millions. He reached out and touched the cool metal casing, his reflection faint in its polished curve. "You'd better work," he whispered. "They're counting on you." Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the storm this time, but from the distant sound of bombers training in the night sky. The age of jets was no longer an idea. It was coming, and Moss, the forgotten genius, was already racing to meet it. Summer of 1942. The walls of General Electric's secret testing hangar vibrated like a living thing. Men in oil-stained coveralls scurried between crates and cables, their movements quick, deliberate, almost militaristic. Outside, the American war machine was roaring into full production: tanks, bombers, ships. But here, in this echoing chamber of turbines and flame, a smaller revolution was unfolding. Dr. Sanford Moss stood near the control booth, hands clasped behind his back, watching as technicians bolted the prototype jet engine, the GEIA, to its steel test stand. The air was heavy with the scent of kerosene and metal, a smell that had become as familiar to him as his own breath. "This is the one," he murmured. His assistant, Charlie Brandt, adjusted his goggles and gave a nervous grin. "You said that last time." Moss smirked faintly. "Yes. And last time, we learned what not to do." The exchange was small, almost playful, but beneath it ran a tension that everyone in the room could feel. The last test had ended in near disaster, a combustion backfire that scorched the ceiling and singed 3 men's eyebrows. Yet even failure had a rhythm to it, a strange sense of progress. Now the stakes were higher. Washington had made it clear, the jet engine project was no longer an experiment, it was a military directive. Moss had been briefed by men in crisp uniforms who spoke of technological parity and air superiority, their tone polite but their message unmistakable: deliver results, or we'll find someone who can. It wasn't a threat Moss feared for himself, but for the work. His team had poured everything into this machine: sweat, nerves, sometimes even blood. Losing it to bureaucrats who only saw deadlines would be unbearable. As the countdown began, Moss stepped closer to the observation window. The IA looked primitive, little more than a steel cylinder wrapped in pipes, but within it was power beyond imagination. He remembered something Frank Whittle had said in a letter months before: "When it runs right, it doesn't sound like an engine at all. It sounds like the future." Moss took a breath and gave the signal. Charlie opened the fuel valve. The turbine began to spin, slow at first, then faster, the whine climbing like a violin string drawn taut. A spark, a flash, and then a steady, rising scream that filled the hangar with a noise no one had ever heard before. The gauges danced. Heat shimmered across the test cell. The pressure climbed into the green zone and stayed there. For 30 seconds, then 40. A minute. The sound was almost hypnotic, a smooth, unbroken roar. "She's running," Charlie shouted over the din. Moss didn't answer. He was watching the exhaust plume, pale blue fire slicing the air. Every instinct told him to expect failure, another explosion, another broken dream. But the engine kept going. When it finally shut down, the the silence felt unreal. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as the turbine wound to a stop, a single cheer broke the stillness, followed by another, and soon the entire team was shouting, laughing, slapping backs. Charlie threw his arms in the air. It works. It actually works. Moss just stood there, blinking through the smoke. He was too tired to cheer. No, he said softly, it lives. It wasn't pride he felt, it was relief, something deep and old, like a prayer answered after years of waiting. The news reached Washington within hours. GE's success made headlines in classified briefings. The War Department ordered immediate collaboration with Bell Aircraft to build a working jet plane, the XP-59A. Moss was named technical advisor, though the role was more symbolic than authoritative. The military had its own engineers now, its own pace. But he didn't mind. The hard part, the impossible part, had been done. By the fall of 1942, Moss's quiet lab had transformed into a command center of innovation. Bell engineers arrived daily, bringing drawings and questions. They were younger, brasher, impatient to get airborne. Charlie joked that they treated Moss like a relic from another era, the grandfather of the jet age. Moss didn't argue. He was older, slower, but he'd earned the right to move at his own rhythm. His satisfaction came from seeing the idea take flight, literally. Yet, as the project advanced, tensions began to show. The new engineers wanted speed, shortcuts, production. Moss insisted on precision. The air doesn't forgive sloppiness, he warned. You rush this, and you'll lose a pilot before you gain a victory. They listened politely and did it their way. Tests of the XP-59A began at Muroc Dry Lake in California, what would later be called Edwards Air Force Base. Moss watched from afar, receiving reports through coded telegrams. The first flight was rough. The engine stalled midair, the landing nearly catastrophic. Moss sighed when he read the dispatch. They're still trying to make a stallion run before it can stand. In the following months, things improved. The XP-59A eventually achieved stable flight. Photographs, classified of course, showed the strange, sleek plane cutting through desert air. Moss studied them with quiet pride. But behind the celebration he felt a creeping sense of irony. The war was moving faster than even he could imagine. Jet technology, once dismissed as science fiction, was suddenly being pursued by every major power. Germany's Me-262 had already taken to the skies. The Allies were not the first after all. Moss's invention, once secret, was now part of a global race. He received a letter from Whittle, the British pioneer he so admired. It seems we've opened Pandora's box, it read. And the contents, as always, are both brilliant and terrible. Moss understood. The jet engine was not just a machine, it was a weapon, one that would change warfare forever. Its speed would make dogfighting obsolete, its power would shrink continents, and someday, perhaps, it would carry more than bombs. The thought unsettled him. By early 1944, Moss was quietly phased out of the project. Officially, he was retiring, but he knew the truth. The new generation was taking over. Younger engineers with fresher energy, sharper ambition, and none of his hesitation about where the technology might lead. At his farewell gathering, Charlie raised a glass. To Dr. Moss, he said, the man who taught machines to breathe fire. The men cheered, but Moss only smiled faintly. Let's hope, he replied, we can still control what they burn. Afterward, he walked the factory floor one last time. The turbines glinted under fluorescent light, rows upon rows of them, each one a child of his first spark. He felt no bitterness, only a strange melancholy. The work would continue without him, as it should. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something immense had been set loose in the world, something that would outgrow its makers. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of engines from a nearby airfield, deep, smooth, and unmistakably jet-powered. Moss paused and looked toward the horizon. He thought of the men who would fly them, the wars they might fight, the skies they might conquer or destroy. A line from his old notebooks surfaced in his mind. Power is neither good nor evil. It only reveals what we truly are. He buttoned his coat, the winter air biting at his hands, and walked away from the lab without looking back. The snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the tracks of the departing trucks. In a world preparing for faster, louder wars, Sanford Moss vanished quietly into history, his name soon forgotten, but his creation, his impossible dream of air and fire, had already taken flight. October 1, 1944. The desert dawn over Muroc Air Base glowed pale and cold, the horizon a thin blade of gold cutting through the morning haze. On the runway, the Bell XP-59A sat waiting, a creature of metal and ambition, its swept nacelles glinting faintly in the rising light. Mechanics moved like ghosts around it, their breath forming clouds in the chill air, their motions brisk, silent, rehearsed. Inside the hangar, Captain Lawrence Craigie tightened the straps of his flight harness and glanced once at the photograph tucked into his pocket, his wife and daughter, smiling in soft sepia tones. First jet flight in American history, someone had said earlier. Make it count. He intended to. Dr. Sanford Moss watched from a distance, standing beside a row of officers and engineers. Though officially retired, he had been invited as an observer, a courtesy gesture more than anything. Yet the old engineer could feel the gravity of the moment pressing on him like a physical weight. He'd seen his turbine spin to life countless times, but never had it been strapped to wings, never trusted with a man's life at 30,000 feet. The engine was no longer an experiment, it was a beating heart that would either prove its worth or tear itself apart. The command came over the loudspeaker. Pilot to cockpit. Craigie climbed the ladder, his boots echoing against the metal skin of the aircraft. Moss found himself holding his breath as the canopy lowered with a solid click. The mechanics cleared the area. Silence fell over the runway. A signal flag dropped. The turbine began to whine, a low, gathering hum that built into a rising scream, smooth and continuous, unlike any piston engine. The XP-59A shuddered, then began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. Dust swirled in its wake. The roar deepened, and before Moss could even blink, the plane lifted gracefully into the air, a silver streak climbing against the desert sky. For the first time in history, an American jet plane was flying. The crowd below erupted in cheers. Engineers clapped each other on the shoulders, shouting over the diminishing sound. Moss didn't cheer. He only watched, his chest tight, as the small speck banked left and right, the sun catching its wings. Every sound, every vibration, seemed to echo the pulse in his veins. In the control tower, the radio crackled. Smooth climb, no vibrations, fuel pressure holding steady. Craigie's voice was calm, professional, almost casual. But then came a pause. Temperature's rising, he said. Looks like the turbine's running hotter than expected. Moss's hands tightened. He knew that tone, a pilot's attempt to sound unconcerned. The jet circled once more, banking toward the sun, and then, abruptly, the calm voice returned. Throttle response sluggish. Might be compressor stall. The officers glanced at each other. Moss stepped forward. Tell him to ease back, not to force it, he said sharply. The radio officer nodded, relaying the message. Another tense minute passed. The jet dipped slightly, then steadied. Stabilized, came Craigie's reply, his voice strained but steady. Engines recovering. She's still running. Moss exhaled slowly. Around him, the officers relaxed, some laughing nervously. But Moss couldn't shake the image that flashed in his mind, metal blades spinning at impossible speeds, the fragile dance of air and fire that could so easily become chaos. The margin between triumph and disaster was a whisper. 20 minutes later, the XP-59A touched down, its tires screeching across the runway. The ground crew ran to meet it, clapping and waving. As the canopy opened, Craigie raised a gloved hand in salute, a broad grin splitting his face. She flies like a dream, he called out. The men erupted in applause. Moss remained still for a moment, then allowed himself the faintest smile. It was done. The machine had proven itself. The dream had taken flight. Yet that night, long after the celebration ended and the airfield lay silent beneath the stars, Moss lingered by the hangar. The XP-59A rested there, its skin still warm from flight. He ran a hand along the fuselage, feeling every rivet, every imperfection. To anyone else, it was a machine. To him, it was a question answered, and another one born. He knew the military would perfect it, replicate it, and soon jets would roar over Europe and the Pacific, rewriting the laws of war. But he couldn't stop wondering what would come next. What would humanity do with such speed, such power? Would they ever be satisfied, or would each victory only build towards something greater and more terrible? Charlie Brandt found him there, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. Moss shook his head. "I was just thinking," he said. "We've given the world wings faster than the wind. I only hope we've also taught it to think before it flies." Charlie chuckled. "You always did sound like a philosopher when you're tired." He handed Moss the coffee. "For what it's worth, you changed history, Doctor. Maybe even saved it." Moss looked at the young man, the same assistant who once doubted the first test, who now stood taller, confident, hardened by war and wonder alike. "No," Moss said quietly. "We only delayed the next mistake." He smiled faintly. "But perhaps that's all anyone ever does." A gust of wind swept across the desert, rustling the papers on a nearby workbench. One sheet caught Moss's eye, a blueprint sketch of a twin-engine variant already in planning. The military was moving fast. He thought of the chain reaction this would set off: faster fighters, deadlier bombers, nations chasing the horizon at any cost. Progress, unstoppable and unmerciful. He folded the blueprint carefully and set it back down. Years later, after the war ended and the world learned the word jet as easily as bomb, Moss's name faded from public memory. Newspapers hailed the aircraft manufacturers, the pilots, the generals. Few remembered the quiet man who made the engine breathe. But among those who had worked beside him, his legend endured, not as a hero, but as something rarer, a man who had seen the dawn of a new age and understood both its brilliance and its peril. In 1954, when the first supersonic flight was announced, a young reporter tracked down Moss, now a gray-haired retiree living in a modest house overlooking Lake George. "Dr. Moss," the reporter asked, "how does it feel, knowing your invention made all this possible?" Moss gazed at the horizon where contrails crossed like scars of silver. "Proud," he said after a long pause, "and a little afraid." The reporter looked puzzled. "Afraid? Of what?" Moss smiled gently. "Of how quickly we forget what power costs us to earn." He turned his gaze back to the sky, where a jet roared overhead, its sound fading into distance like a memory. Beneath that fading echo, the world carried on, faster, louder, ever hungry for the next miracle. And somewhere in that endless pursuit of speed and dominance, the quiet truth of one forgotten genius lingered, that the engines of progress, once ignited, can never truly be turned off. As the reporter left, Moss remained seated by the window, the last light of day catching the faint gleam of a model turbine on his desk. He reached out and spun it once with a trembling finger. It whirred softly, a whisper of the past. Outside, the lake reflected the crimson sunset, a sky burning with the same fire he had once taught to fly. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. The sound was gentle now, almost peaceful. But he knew that somewhere, high above the clouds, that same sound still screamed across the heavens. A sound born from his hands, forever chasing the limits of the human will. And with that thought, Sanford Moss smiled one last time. The forgotten genius had not built a weapon. He had built the future.